The heavy camera bag slammed into the groundskeeper's jaw, my only weapon. My husband's grave bore his face, dated 3 years before we met. The PI's call crackled in my ear. David Thompson doesn't exist. My hands shook as I traced the cold stone. Who the hell did I marry? The name on the headstone burned into my vision. My wedding ring suddenly felt like a handcuff. 7 years, gone. The groundskeeper groaned behind me, but I didn't turn. The truth was worse than his fists. My husband was a ghost, and I'd slept next to him. The steering wheel groaned under Sarah's grip, the leather sticky against her palms. 2 car lengths ahead, David's silver sedan drifted through the rusted iron gates of Oak Grove. He hadn't touched his turn signal once since leaving the office parking lot 3 hours before his shift ended. Sarah killed her headlights, letting the engine's hum fade into the heavy afternoon humidity of the New Jersey marshlands. The cemetery smelled of damp earth and rotting cedar. David pulled to the curb near a cluster of crumbling Victorian monuments. He stepped out, his suit jacket draped over one arm, shoulders slumped in a way Sarah hadn't seen in their 15 years of marriage. He didn't check his surroundings. He marched toward a weathered headstone shaded by a weeping willow, his shoes crunching through dry twigs. Sarah slid from her seat, the door latch clicking like a gunshot in the silence. She crouched behind a granite angel, the stone rough and cold against her shoulder blades. Her thumb hovered over the camera shutter on her phone. Through the lens, David appeared smaller, a gray smudge against the vibrant green moss. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled slip of paper, and began to speak. His lips moved in frantic, silent bursts. "Is this where you go?" she whispered, the humidity coating her throat. David dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands. A low, jagged sob escaped him, cutting through the rhythmic chirping of hidden cicadas. Sarah froze. This wasn't a mistress or a secret bank meeting. The air grew thick with the scent of mown grass and old secrets. She pressed the capture button, the digital shutter sound echoing off the tombs. But David remained hunched over, oblivious to the woman documenting his collapse from the shadows. Sarah kept her breathing shallow, the rhythm of her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She began her count, 1, 2, 3, 4, focusing on the cadence to keep her hands from shaking. She adjusted her position, the damp grass soaking through her leggings. David was moving now, his fingers tracing the letters on the stone with a tenderness that felt like a betrayal. Every time he touched the granite, Sarah felt a phantom chill, as if the cold of the grave was reaching through the humidity to touch her. She zoomed the lens in further, the digital display graining as it fought the low light. She needed to see the name. She needed the sequence to make sense. David stood up, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and turned back toward his car. Sarah ducked, pressing her face into the mossy side of the angel. The smell of wet stone and ancient dust filled her lungs. She heard his car door thud shut, the engine turning over with a mechanical cough, and then the receding crunch of tires on gravel. Silence returned to Oak Grove, broken only by the distant hum of the turnpike. Sarah rose, her joints popping. She didn't head for her car. She headed for the willow. The grass near the grave was flattened where David had knelt. Sarah stood over the plot, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the grass. She looked down at the headstone. Her breath hitched, catching in a throat that suddenly felt lined with sandpaper. The face etched into the small porcelain oval embedded in the granite was unmistakable. It was David. The same sharp nose, the same slight dip in the chin, the same intense eyes that usually looked at her over the breakfast table. But the name carved into the stone wasn't David Miller. David Thompson. Born June 12, 1985. Died September 14th, 2014. The date of death was 3 years before she had met him in that coffee shop in Hoboken. 3 years before, he had told her he was a lonely architect from Chicago looking for a fresh start. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool porcelain of the photo. The man in the picture was younger, but the likeness was haunting. It was like looking at a ghost that had decided to put on a suit and marry her. A sharp clink sounded behind her. Sarah spun around, her heels slipping on the slick mud. A man stood 20 feet away, leaning on a rusted iron shovel. He wore a tattered canvas jacket and a hat pulled low over a face that looked like a crumpled map. This was the groundskeeper, Miller. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed company. "Gates are closed, lady," he rasped. His voice sounded like stones grinding together in a silk bag. He took a step forward, the shovel blade scraping against a concrete curb with a screech that set Sarah's teeth on edge. I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice thin. She tried to step back, but her heel caught on a protruding root. "I was just leaving. You were hovering," Miller said. He stepped closer, the smell of cheap tobacco and gasoline trailing after him. "People come here to mourn, not to play detective with their fancy phones." He lunged forward with surprising speed, his hand, rough and calloused like tree bark, clamping onto Sarah's upper arm. The grip was iron. Sarah felt the bruise forming instantly. "Let go of me," she hissed. The old gymnastics training kicked in, the instinct to find her center, to use the weight of her opponent against them. She didn't scream. She acted. She swung her heavy camera bag in a wide, punishing arc. The weighted base of the bag, packed with lenses and batteries, slammed into the center of the groundskeeper's chest. The air left his lungs in a wet oomph. He stumbled back, his grip breaking as he gasped for air, his shovel clattering onto a flat grave marker. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and sprinted, her feet finding the rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4, as she tore through the rows of the dead. She could hear Miller shouting behind her, a jagged, coughing sound, but she didn't look back. She reached her SUV, yanked the door open, and threw herself inside. She slammed the lock button, the mechanical thunk providing the first ounce of safety she'd felt in an hour. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely fit the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, she floored it, the tires spitting gravel as she roared out of the cemetery. She didn't stop until she was 3 miles away, pulled over under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a closed gas station. The interior of the car felt like a vacuum. Sarah reached for the burner phone she kept hidden in the glove box, a precaution she'd started a month ago when David's late nights at the office began to feel like a script. She dialed the number for James Cunningham, the private investigator she'd hired to run a quiet background check. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Cunningham. It's Sarah. I'm at the cemetery. I found a grave, James. It has his face on it. But the name is Thompson." There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated only by the low, mournful hum of a funeral dirge Cunningham was known to play in his office. "Listen to me carefully, Sarah," Cunningham said, his voice dropping an octave. "I just finished the deep dive on the Social Security numbers you gave me. The David Miller you're married to, he doesn't exist. Not before 7 years ago. There's no high school record, no birth certificate, no tax filings. It's like he stepped out of a vacuum in 2017. Sarah felt the world tilt. The steering wheel felt like it was melting under her hands. "What are you saying?" I'm saying the man in your house is a ghost who stole a dead man's skin, Cunningham replied. And Sarah? The real David Thompson didn't die of natural causes. He drowned in a boating accident in Philadelphia, an accident where the only survivor was his business partner. Subverted beat 1.4. Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She had hired Cunningham because she wanted clarity. She wanted to prove her suspicions wrong so she could go back to her perfect life. Back to the counting and the 5-mile runs and the belief that she was in control. She had spent $3,000 of her secret savings to buy peace of mind. I have the full report ready, Cunningham continued. I can meet you tonight. We can take this to the police. With the evidence I've pulled from the state archives, we can have him in custody by morning. You're safe now, Sarah. I've got the paper trail. He can't run from this. Relief washed over her, thick and heavy. She closed her eyes, her shoulders finally dropping from her ears. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sequence was closing. She had the truth, she had a witness, and she had a plan. Cunningham was a former cop. He knew the procedure. This was the smart move. This was how a professional handled a crisis. Thank you, James, she whispered. I'm coming to your office now. Take the back roads, he advised. I'll have the coffee on. Sarah pulled back onto the road, her heart rate slowing. She was winning. She was the gymnast who had stuck the landing after a terrifying wobble. She drove toward the city, her mind already rehearsing the conversation with the district attorney. She would protect Madison. She would untangle the lies. She arrived at Cunningham's office, a nondescript brick building near the docks, 20 minutes later. The lights were on in his second-floor window. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the hollow hallway. She pushed open the door, a smile of gratitude forming on her lips. James, She stopped. The office was a wreck. Files were strewn across the floor like fallen leaves. The smell of stale peppermint was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the ozone scent of a discharged taser. Cunningham wasn't behind his desk. He was slumped in the corner, his hands zip-tied behind his back, a heavy piece of silver duct tape across his mouth. His eyes were wide, pleading, tracking something behind the door. Sarah turned, but she was too slow. A hand clamped over her mouth, smelling of expensive sandalwood soap and the metallic scent of David's office. A familiar voice whispered into her ear, the tone as smooth as velvet and just as suffocating. You really shouldn't have spent our savings on such a poor investment, honey, David said. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need one. He held up Sarah's burner phone. The screen was cracked. He had been listening to the entire conversation. He hadn't just found the investigator. He had used Sarah's own smart move to lure her to a secondary location where no one would hear her scream. The lifeline she had built was nothing more than a leash he had been pulling on the whole time. James was very helpful, David murmured, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear. He gave me his passwords. He gave me the hard drive. And now he's going to give me a reason to tell the police that a distraught wife attacked her private investigator in a fit of paranoia. Sarah's world collapsed. She hadn't found safety. She had handed David the map to her only sanctuary. She was now standing in a room with a dead man walking and a hostage, and the only person who knew the truth was currently bleeding out on a linoleum floor. Let's go home, Sarah, David said, his grip tightening on her jaw. We have so much to discuss before the bank opens in the morning. The drive home was a nightmare of silence. David drove her SUV, his knuckles white on the wheel, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands tucked under her thighs to hide their shaking. She watched the gray New Jersey skyline blur past, the industrial smokestacks looking like giant fingers pointing at her failure. When they pulled into the driveway of their pristine suburban home, the porch light flickered. 1, 2, 3, 4. It felt like a mockery. David walked her inside, his hand firmly on the small of her back, a gesture that looked like affection to any neighbor watching, but felt like a cattle prod to Sarah. "Go to the kitchen," David commanded, his voice returning to that chillingly calm architect's tone. "I'll make us some tea? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah sat at the island, the cold marble biting into her skin. She watched him move, efficient, graceful, the perfect husband. He set a kettle on the stove, the blue flame licking the bottom of the steel. The smell of Earl Grey began to fill the room, a domestic scent that felt like a poison. "Where is Madison?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "With your mother," David said, not looking back. "I told her you were having a bit of a breakdown and needed a quiet night. She was very understanding. She always did think you pushed yourself too hard, Sarah. All that counting, all that running." He turned, leaning against the counter, his eyes unblinking. "Why did you go to the cemetery, Sarah? We were doing so well. We had the house, the car, the reputation. Why dig up things that were meant to stay buried?" "You're David Thompson," she whispered. "The real David Miller is dead." David cracked his knuckles, thumb to pinky, the rapid fire popping sounding like dry sticks breaking. "Names are just labels on a file, Sarah. I'm the man who has provided for you for 7 years. I'm the man who held your hand when Madison was born. Does the name on a headstone change that?" "You stole his life," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Cunningham said there was an accident. You were his partner. You let him drown so you could become him." David sighed, a long, weary sound. "It wasn't that simple. It never is. But you've made things very complicated, Sarah. And complicated things have to be simplified." He walked toward her, and for a moment, Sarah saw the predator beneath the skin. She realized then that he wasn't just gaslighting her. He was preparing the ground for her disappearance. The next morning, the house felt like a tomb. David had fallen asleep on the sofa, a heavy-duty flashlight resting on his chest. But Sarah hadn't closed her eyes once. She waited until the sun began to bleed through the blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the kitchen floor. She needed to know how deep the rot went. While David's breathing remained rhythmic and heavy, she crept toward the hallway closet where they kept the family laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys, her mind racing. She logged into their joint Chase account, her heart hammering. The balance line read, $4.12. The $50,000 they had saved for Madison's college fund, the emergency cushion Sarah had insisted on. It was gone. The transaction history showed a single wire transfer at 4:30 p.m. the previous day. Destination: an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. David wasn't just hiding, he was liquidating. He was preparing to shed the David Miller's skin and vanish, leaving her and Madison with nothing but a mountain of debt and a fraudulent marriage certificate. She closed the laptop, her stomach churning. She needed leverage. She needed something David couldn't explain away with a smile and a hand on the shoulder. She moved to his home office, the room smelling of industrial bleach and old paper. She began to systematic search, her movements precise. 1, 2, 3, 4. She checked the bookshelves, the floorboards, the lining of his suit jackets. In the bottom drawer of his desk, tucked behind a stack of architectural blueprints, she found a small, leather-bound briefcase. It was locked. Sarah didn't have the key, but she had a letter opener and a decade of suppressed rage. She jammed the metal tip into the lock and twisted. The mechanism snapped with a satisfying crack. Inside was a single manila envelope. She pulled out the contents, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. It was a life insurance policy for $1 million, naming David Miller as the beneficiary. The insured? Emily Thompson. And pinned to the back of the policy was a document that made the air vanish from the room. An official death certificate from the state of Pennsylvania, dated 3 years ago. Emily Thompson. Cause of death: accidental drowning. Sarah's mind flashed back to the cemetery. The woman she had seen, the one with the jagged scar on her eyebrow, the one who had been weeping over the Thompson grave, was Emily. Sarah had seen a dead woman breathing. A shadow fell across the doorway. "I told you not to touch the 2018 stack, Sarah," David said. He was standing in the hall, his silhouette blocking the light. The alignment is perfect. Or it was. He walked into the room, his eyes fixed on the death certificate in her hand. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher catching a favorite student cheating on a test. "You're over-rotating again, honey," he said softly. He didn't move to take the paper. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single black leather glove. He walked over to her and laid it gently on her shoulder. The leather was cold, smelling of the damp garage. "I found this in the car," he lied. "You must have dropped it when you were exploring." It was a warning, a physical mark. He was telling her that he was everywhere, that every move she made was being tracked, and that the safety of her home was an illusion he could revoke at any second. "Go wash up," David said, his voice returning to its velvet smoothness. "I have to run some errands. Why don't you take Madison to the park when she gets back? You need the fresh air." He left the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Sarah stood frozen, the death certificate crinkling in her grip. She knew then that she couldn't wait for Cunningham or the police. She was in a race, and David had already started his final lap. She waited until she heard his car pull out of the driveway before she moved. She didn't go to the park. She went to the garage. The garage was 10 degrees colder than the house, the concrete floor radiating a damp chill that seeped into her bones. She began to search the workbench, looking for... she didn't know what. A passport? A map? She was reaching for a heavy metal toolbox when a hand grabbed her hair from behind and yanked. Sarah's head snapped back, a scream dying in her throat as her spine hit the cold metal of the workbench. A man stood over her, not David, but a mountain of a human with scarred knuckles and a nose that had been broken more than once. This was Rick. "Where is it, lady?" Rick growled. He smelled of organic dog treats and stale sweat. He slammed a hand against the workbench next to her head, the impact vibrating through her skull. "The $500,000 David said it was in the house. I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah gasped, her fingers fumbling behind her for anything she could use as a weapon. "Don't lie to me," Rick said, his voice weary. He reached for a heavy coil of rope on the bench. "David owes my boss a lot of money for that Philadelphia mess. He said his loving wife would have the ledger. Now, are you going to be smart, or am I going to have to put you in the trunk?" He lunged for her, his massive hands reaching for her throat. Sarah dropped low, her gymnastics training taking over. She slid under his arm, her hand closing around a heavy pipe wrench. As he turned, she swung with everything she had. The wrench connected with Rick's knee with a sickening crunch. He let out a guttural roar of pain, collapsing to one side. Sarah didn't stop. She scrambled toward the door leading back into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You're dead!" Rick screamed, clutching his shattered kneecap. "David set you up. He told us to come get it. He's clearing the floor, lady." Sarah slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. She ran through the kitchen, her feet pounding a frantic rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4, and dived into the laundry room. It was the only room in the house with a brand new deadbolt on the inside. She locked it, sliding down the wall until her back hit the humming dryer. The thud, thud, thud of the machine felt like a heartbeat. She was trapped in her own home, hunted by her husband's past, and realized with a terrifying clarity that David hadn't just lied to her. He had served her up as a distraction to buy himself time to disappear. She sat in the dark, the smell of detergent and scorched dust filling her lungs. Her hand brushed against a loose floorboard near the base of the washing machine. She frowned, her fingers tracing the edge. It was slightly raised. She pried it up, her nails breaking against the wood. Inside was a small, waterproof pouch. She pulled it out and zipped it open. Inside was a flash drive and a second death certificate. Emily Thompson. The date was the same, but the cause of death was different. This one said, "Homicide by blunt force trauma." And underneath it was a photo of a younger David, his face covered in blood, standing over a woman who looked exactly like the one Sarah had seen at the cemetery. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Emily wasn't a victim. She wasn't dead. She was the leverage, and David was the one who had tried to kill her. The house went silent. The humming of the dryer stopped. "Sarah?" David's voice came from right outside the laundry room door. It was soft, melodic, and utterly terrifying. "I know you're in there, honey, and I know you found the pouch. Why don't you come out so we can talk about the bigger picture?" Subverted beat 3.3. Sarah gripped the flash drive, her knuckles white. She had the evidence now. The files on this drive, she could see the labels through the clear plastic, were marked Philadelphia Project, Final Audit. This was it. This was the proof that David had been framed for the fraud. The proof that he was a victim of a larger corporate conspiracy. If she could just get this to the authorities, she could save him. She could save them. She felt a surge of hope, a desperate, foolish warmth. Maybe Rick was lying. Maybe David was just protecting her from the people who had truly ruined his life. If she showed him she was on his side, that she had the key to his exoneration, the nightmare would end. "David?" she called out, her voice trembling. "I found it. The audit. I can help you. We can go to the police together. We can prove you were framed." There was a long pause. Sarah heard the floorboards creak as he stepped closer to the door. "You found the audit?" David asked. His voice sounded thick, almost choked with emotion. "You'd do that for me? After everything?" "I love you, David. I just wanted the truth." She reached for the lock, her fingers hovering over the cold metal. "I have the investigator's number. I can call him right now. He has a contact at the FBI. "Call him," David said. "Go ahead, Sarah. Tell him you have the drive." Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket, her breath hitching. She dialed Cunningham's number, her heart soaring. This was the moment. The smart play. She was the hero of her own story. The phone rang. Once. Twice. And then she heard it. The ringing wasn't coming from the earpiece. It was coming from the other side of the laundry room door. The low, vibrating hum of Cunningham's funeral dirge filled the hallway. Sarah froze. Her thumb hovered over the end call button. The sound was unmistakable. It was the ringtone she had assigned to the investigator. "James?" she whispered into the phone. The door erupted. David didn't use a key. He used his shoulder, the wood splintering with a sound like a bone snapping. He stepped into the small room, his eyes dark and hollow. In his hand, he held Cunningham's phone. "James can't come to the phone right now, Sarah," David said. He tossed the device onto the top of the dryer, where it skittered and fell to the floor. "And he can't call the FBI, because I've been reading every text, every email, and every secret report you've been sending him for the last 3 weeks." He stepped toward her, his presence filling the narrow space. "Did you really think you could outrun me? In my own house? On my own network?" The hope she had felt moments ago turned into a cold, oily sludge in her stomach. The flash drive, the evidence that was going to save them, wasn't a lifeline. It was a lure. "I didn't frame myself, Sarah," David hissed, pinning her against the vibrating washing machine. "I built that fraud. And that drive doesn't contain an audit. It contains the keys to the accounts you just helped me drain by logging in this morning. I needed a local IP address to authorize the final transfer. Your investigation gave me the perfect cover." He reached out and snatched the drive from her hand. He didn't even look at it. He just dropped it into his pocket. "You weren't solving the mystery, Sarah," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "You were completing the transaction. Thank you for being so predictably smart." Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. She hadn't been fighting back. She had been the final piece of the puzzle he needed to finish his crime. She was isolated. Her only ally was likely dead. And she had just handed her husband the very thing he needed to destroy her. "Now," David said, his voice returning to that terrifying, calm architect's tone. "Let's go to the kitchen. We have a guest arriving, and it would be rude not to have the table set." He dragged her into the kitchen, his grip bruising her arm. The room was a disaster. Shattered porcelain from their perfect dinner service littered the floor, glinting like diamonds in the harsh overhead light. The back door creaked open. Emily Thompson stepped inside. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a hunter. She held a small black handgun leveled at David's chest. Her gaunt face was tight, the scar through her eyebrow pulsing red in the kitchen's fluorescent glow. "You're late with the payment, David," Emily whispered. Her voice was a gravelly rasp that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. "And I don't like waiting in cemeteries." David didn't flinch. He let go of Sarah, stepping back with his hands raised in a mock gesture of surrender. "The transfer took longer than expected, Emily. Sarah here was being inquisitive." Emily turned her gaze to Sarah, her eyes cold and devoid of empathy. "The second wife. You have his eyes, kid. Too bad you didn't have his sense for when to stop digging. You're his partner," Sarah said, her voice a hollow echo. "You weren't a victim. You helped him steal the identity." "I gave him the identity," Emily corrected, her finger tightening on the trigger. "David Thompson was my brother. He was a loser, a drunk who fell off a boat because he couldn't hold his gin. We just didn't see the point in letting a perfectly good Social Security number go to waste." She looked back at David. "The money, David. Now. Or the girl gets a hole in her gymnastics perfect heart, and I tell the cops you did it in a fit of domestic rage. I've already got the dead woman paperwork. I can disappear. You can't." The standoff was a cold, vibrating wire. Sarah stood between them, a pawn in a game she had only just begun to understand. The kitchen smelled of burning garlic and ozone. "I don't have the full amount yet," David said, his voice finally showing a sliver of fear. "The wire is still pending." "Give me an hour." "You don't have an hour," Emily hissed. She raised the gun, but she didn't point it at David. She pointed it at the ceiling. "I called the police 5 minutes ago," Emily said, a jagged smile twisting her face. "Reported a domestic disturbance. Shots fired. By the time they get here, you'll be holding the gun, David. And I'll be dead again, with a suitcase full of your offshore cash." The sirens began in the distance, a faint, rhythmic wail that cut through the heavy New Jersey night. Sarah looked at the missing knife in the block. She looked at the flash drive in David's pocket. She began to count. 1. She saw the way Emily's weight shifted to her left leg, the same way her coach used to before a vault. 2. She saw David's eyes darting toward the back door, calculating the distance. 3. She remembered the fire drill, the speed, the precision, the way a 4-count rhythm was the only thing standing between a perfect landing and a broken neck. 4. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't plead. She lunged. She went low, a perfect floor exercise roll that took her under Emily's line of sight. She slammed her shoulder into Emily's knees, the impact sending the older woman crashing back against the stainless steel refrigerator. The gun fired. The roar was deafening in the small kitchen. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, the smell of cordite stinging Sarah's nose. She didn't stop. She scrambled up, her fingers clawing for the flash drive in David's pocket as he stumbled back in shock. She felt the plastic edges. She yanked it free. "Madison!" Sarah screamed. The little girl appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was clutching her dollhouse, her knuckles white. "Run to the pantry, Maddie. Hide in the fort. Don't come out until you hear the bells." The bells. The emergency signal they had practiced 100 times. David lunged for Sarah, his face a mask of primal rage. "Give me that drive, you bitch!" He tackled her, the two of them crashing into the kitchen table. Wood splintered. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her ribs, but she held onto the drive. She reached into her own pocket and pressed the small, recessed button on the side of the device. The drive wasn't just a storage device. It was a GPS tracker Cunningham had given her during their first meeting. A just-in-case measure she had forgotten until this very second. A high-pitched digital beep emitted from the drive. The sirens were closer now. The red and blue lights began to dance across the kitchen walls, staining the shattered porcelain the color of dried blood. "It's over, David," Sarah gasped, her lungs burning. "The police are here. They have the tracker. They have everything." The front door burst open. "Police, drop the weapon. Hands in the air." Officer Robert Taylor stepped into the room, his duty belt jingling, his face a mask of professional intensity. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at the gun in Emily's hand. "Drop it." Now, Emily looked at David. She looked at the police. Then, with a scream of frustration, she turned the gun on herself. Click. The chamber was empty. Taylor was on her in a second, his weight slamming her into the floor. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. 2 more officers grabbed David, hauling him off Sarah. He didn't fight. He just stared at her, his eyes cold and hollow, the David Miller mask finally shattered beyond repair. "Sarah Miller?" Taylor asked, helping her to her feet. Sarah nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the flash drive in her hand. The digital beep was still pulsing. 1, 2, 3, 4. I have the records, she whispered. I have the proof. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and sterile questions. Sarah sat on her porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of laundry detergent and safety. She watched as the forensic teams moved through her house, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. She saw them lead David out in silence. He didn't look back. He didn't look like a husband or an architect or a ghost. He just looked like a man who had finally run out of names. Madison was asleep in the back of a patrol car, her head resting on a pile of organic dog treats Rick had left on the seat. She was safe. Sarah looked at the welcome mat, now flipped upside down in the chaos. She realized she had been walking over a warning for 7 years. She stood up, her joints popping. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the suburban street. The sun was beginning to rise, a thin line of gold breaking through the New Jersey gray. The humidity was gone. The air smelled of rain and ozone and fresh starts. Sarah took a deep breath. She didn't count. She didn't pace. She just stood there, her feet planted firmly on the ground, watching the light reclaim the world. She wasn't a teammate anymore. She wasn't a pawn. She was Sarah Miller. And for the first time in her life, the silence didn't need a rhythm to be beautiful. The end. Do not proceed. Past this point,